I knew my daughter married into a wealthy family, but I didn't know they'd mock me the moment I walked through their door. They laughed at my cheap gift, sneered at the wooden box my late husband carved, and tossed aside the document he meant for our daughter. I stayed quiet until the box disappeared, and the police arrived at their perfect doorstep. I never wanted revenge. I just wanted the truth. But what unfolded exposed more than a stolen heirloom. It revealed who my daughter's real family truly was, and who never deserved her in the first place. Before we continue with this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel as we have a special story that'll be released soon. I arrived at the Harper residence just before sunset, the sky still holding onto the last strands of pink and gold. Their house looked like something pulled from the pages of a glossy magazine. Clean lines, tall windows, the kind of place that made you instinctively smooth your clothes before knocking. I stood on the front step for a moment, holding the gift in my hands, feeling its small weight as if it were pulsing with the memory of my husband. I had wrapped it myself that morning, carefully folding the paper and tying the ribbon the way he used to wrap Christmas presents. It was simple, nothing extravagant, but it meant something. That alone made it feel valuable. When the door opened, Lila's mother-in-law, Vivian, blinked at me in a way that felt like being scanned rather than greeted. Her eyes dropped immediately to the package I held, and I saw the flicker, quick, sharp, unmistakable, before she rearranged her face into something polite. Or almost polite. Her smile was tight enough to snap. "Oh," she said, as though that single syllable held an entire novel's worth of judgment. "You brought something." "I did," I replied, keeping my tone calm, neutral. "Just a little something for the family." She stepped aside to let me in. The moment I crossed the threshold, I felt swallowed by the house's immaculate perfection. Everything had a sheen. Marble floors that reflected the chandelier above them. Walls painted a shade of white so bright it almost hummed. The living room was full already. Lila, her husband Aaron, and his two sisters perched on the velvet sofa like a set of matching figurines. Lila saw me and stood up quickly, smoothing her dress as she walked over. She hugged me, a soft, nervous squeeze, the kind that said more than her voice ever would in front of his family. I could feel the tension in her shoulders, the tightness in her breath. She had been trying so hard to fit into this world, to match their expectations, to prove she belonged. Sometimes I wondered if she knew she didn't need to prove anything to me, but she still acted as if she did. "You look beautiful, Mom," she whispered before stepping back. Her sisters-in-law, Alyssa and Grace, gave small nods that weren't so much greetings as acknowledgments of existence. And like their mother, their eyes drifted almost immediately to the gift in my hand. They didn't even try to hide their curiosity or their amusement. Vivian reappeared at my side. "Why don't we put that with the others?" she suggested in a voice coated with sweetness that somehow tasted bitter. She gestured toward a long table near the dining room, covered with gilded decorations and expensive-looking gift bags. Everything sparkled. Everything looked as if it had been chosen specifically to be photographed and admired. My gift, wrapped in soft brown paper and tied with a single deep green ribbon, looked like an intruder. I placed it gently on the table anyway. It didn't matter if it looked out of place. I knew what was inside. I followed them into the dining room, where crystal glasses caught the light, and the silverware gleamed as though it had never been touched by human hands. The air smelled faintly of rosemary and something else, an aroma Lila used to call money scent, a mixture of perfume, polish, and pretension. I took my seat at the far end of the table, and as I sat, I felt a sudden shift in the room. A subtle tightening. A silent question passing between them. What exactly had I brought? Their glances weren't subtle. Vivian leaned toward her daughters, whispering something behind a perfectly manicured hand. Alyssa choked on a laugh. Grace bit her lip to keep hers in. I kept my eyes on the table, breathing slowly, willing my heartbeat to stay steady. I had known there would be judgment. I had known deep down that whatever I brought would be measured not by meaning but by price tag. Still, a small part of me had hoped they might see past the simplicity of the wrapping, hoped they might remember kindness before condescension. But the atmosphere in that room told me otherwise. It sat heavy like a frost, settling into the walls, the chairs, the spaces between breaths. I could already sense the shape of the evening before it fully unfolded. I could already hear the quiet laughter that would come later. And yet, despite everything, I sat up straighter, folded my hands in my lap, and reminded myself why I was there. I was here for my daughter. For Lila. And no amount of polished marble or crystal glasses could shake the meaning of the gift I had brought, no matter how they might try to diminish it. I followed Vivian toward the long table where the gifts were arranged, each one a silent declaration of wealth. The bags were glossy, embossed with designer logos. One even had a ribbon so extravagant it looked like it cost more than my entire present. I didn't let myself hesitate, though my fingers tightened slightly around the little package as I placed it gently among the others. For a moment, its simplicity seemed to swallow the light around it. No shine. No labels. Just soft brown paper and a ribbon tied in a careful knot. I heard the first whisper before I even stepped back. A small, sharp sound that broke the air like a pin popping a balloon. "That's it," Alyssa muttered behind me, her voice barely above a breath but loud enough to reach my ears. "It looks like something from a craft market," Grace added, her tone dipped in amusement. Their mother smirked the way people do when they think they're above you. Chin slightly raised, eyes half-lidded, lips curled as though tasting something sour. "It's quaint," she said. Quaint. That word had always felt like a polite slap. I could feel heat rising up my neck, but I simply folded my hands in front of me and kept my expression soft. Years of being polite, years of letting things slide, years of picking my battles had trained me well. But knowing how to stay calm didn't mean I was numb. Every whisper, every small choked laugh, stabbed at a place inside me I didn't easily expose. I pretended to adjust my sleeve so they wouldn't see the way my fingers trembled. Lila appeared beside me, noticing the tension before any words were spoken. She glanced at the gift table, then at her in-laws, catching the tail end of one of their smirks. Her jaw tightened for a second, just one, but she quickly smoothed her expression, the way someone does when they're walking through a room with explosives and trying not to trigger anything. "Mom's gifts always mean something," she said carefully, lightly, the way someone speaks when they're trying to soothe a hostile animal. "She doesn't give randomly." Vivian smiled at Lila, but there was no warmth in it. "Of course, darling. It's very thoughtful, I'm sure." Thoughtful. Wait. Words they used to politely discard the things that didn't fit their curated world. We walked back to the dining room, and I felt the weight of their eyes on my back. Quiet comments floated through the air. Half sentences, snickered syllables, tiny darts thrown carelessly by people who thought kindness was merely decorative. "Did you see the paper? Brown. Actual brown. Maybe it's homemade jam or something. Or soap. My Pilates instructor gives things like that." I wanted to tell them what was inside that package. I wanted to say the jewelry box was carved by my husband's hands decades ago, that he had sanded it until the wood felt like silk, that he had made it for our daughter long before she fell in love, long before she married into this family that didn't understand the meaning of anything without a receipt. I wanted to say that inside the box was something tied to him, to us, to the roots Lila came from, roots deeper than designer labels or shiny wrapping. But I said nothing. Every word I wanted to speak lodged itself in my throat, too heavy to push out. When I took my seat, I felt the sting most acutely in the silence that followed. Not just the silence of their mockery, but the silence inside my own daughter. Lila sat beside me, but she kept her gaze fixed on her plate, twisting her napkin between her fingers. She didn't join them in laughing, but she didn't defend me either, and somehow that hurt more than the whispers themselves. Vivian clinked her glass lightly with a fork, calling attention to herself. "Well," she said brightly, "now that all the gifts are in place, we can enjoy dinner. I just love when everyone brings something special to the table." The way she said special made my skin crawl. I didn't look at the gift table again. I didn't need to. The memory of their laughter lingered in the air, humming beneath the surface like electricity. Still, I sat up straight, folded my napkin neatly across my lap, and forced myself to look calm. It was an old habit, collecting my dignity piece by piece, even when someone tried to chip it away. What none of them knew, what none of them cared to wonder, was that they hadn't mocked me. Not really. Their laughter wasn't pointed at a box. It was pointed at the memory of the man who had made it. At the decades of love carved into its corners. At a story they would never bother to hear. And as I looked across the table at their polished smiles and sparkling jewelry, I felt something shift quietly inside me. Not bitterness, not anger, but a cold, steady awareness. They had mocked the wrong gift. And they had absolutely no idea what they would be answering for soon. Dinner had barely ended when Vivian clapped her hands together lightly, as if commanding an audience. "Shall we open the gifts now?" she asked, though it wasn't really a question. The room shifted around her, everyone taking their cue. Chairs scraped backward, laughter swelled again, and I followed the group into the living room with a calmness I did not entirely feel. My gift sat on the table like an afterthought, dwarfed by towering bags of tissue paper and ribbons so elaborate they looked architectural. Vivian reached for the first gifts, those from her side, of course. Silk scarves, luxury candles, a designer wallet. Each reveal came with applause and dramatic gasps. I smiled gently at each one, even as the reactions felt choreographed, excessive, almost theatrical. When someone unwrapped a glass vase from a boutique in Milan, there was a round of applause as though they'd just witnessed a performance. Then, inevitably, the moment came. Vivian's hand hovered over my gift. She hesitated, just long enough for the room to catch its breath. "Oh," she said, her tone carrying a note of amusement. "This one is from Lila's mother." The pause before the word mother held an entire paragraph of quiet judgment. She lifted the package, and even the way she held it felt like commentary, the tips of her fingers gripping the ribbon as though she feared the brown paper might stain her manicure. Conversations dimmed. Eyes turned. I watched as she tugged gently on the ribbon, unfolding the paper piece by piece. The soft crackle of the wrapping seemed louder than the murmurs rising behind her. When the paper fell away, the room reacted instantly. It was a small jewelry box, about the size of a hand. Deep brown wood polished smooth, every corner rounded, every edge carefully shaped. Carved on the top was a simple rose, its petals curling outward delicately, as if frozen mid-bloom. My husband, gone 3 years now, had carved it when Lila was just a child. He worked on it at night, smoothing the curves while she slept in her tiny room down the hall. He had planned to give it to her when she turned 18, but he passed before he could see that day. I finished the carving myself, following the marks he left behind. Vivian lifted the lid. Inside, the velvet lining still held the faintest scent of cedar oil, something he had used to protect the wood. Resting in the center was a silver pendant shaped like a leaf. It wasn't expensive. Not in the way they measured value. But it was the first piece of jewelry my husband ever bought for Lila before she was even born. Something he carried in his wallet until the day he died. Something he had planned to give her on her wedding day. A hush fell over the room for half a heartbeat. Then the cracks appeared. "Oh!" Alyssa's voice was the first to break the silence. "It's homemade." Grace let out a soft laugh, one she didn't bother to hide this time. "It's kind of rustic," she said. "Like something from one of those weekend craft fairs." Vivian smiled politely, though the corners of her mouth twitched with condescension. "Very quaint," she said again. "It looks like something from a thrift store." Laughter bubbled across the room as though someone had lit a fuse. Not cruel enough to be overtly hostile, but sharp enough to slice through skin. The kind of laughter people use when they want to disguise cruelty as humor. Lila's face went pale. She reached out quickly, taking the box from her mother-in-law's hands as if to protect it. "This is beautiful," she said, her voice too soft to disguise the tremor underneath. She closed the lid gently, her thumbs brushing over the carved rose. But then she said nothing else. No defense. No explanation. Just silence. She didn't know the full story behind the box. I had wanted to tell her tonight, to hand it to her myself, quietly, meaningfully. But instead, I had watched it be opened like a spectacle, paraded in front of people who saw no value in anything that couldn't be measured with a price tag. I folded my hands tightly in my lap to keep them from shaking. My husband's memory, his hands, his work, his love, had become the punchline of their joke. Maybe it would look cute in a rustic-themed house, Grace added with a grin. You know, something with wooden signs and mason jars. More laughter. I felt the sting rise behind my ribs, sharp and steady. But I forced a small smile, the kind mother's perfect after years of swallowing their own hurt to keep the peace. They didn't know what they were mocking. They didn't know who carved that box, whose love shaped every line, whose memory lived inside it. They didn't know what else had been inside. Something important. Something you could not buy, could not replace, could not simply laugh off. Something that would matter in ways none of them could imagine. Not yet. Soon. Lila held the jewelry box as if it were something fragile, something breakable, something no one else in the room understood. Her fingers trembled almost imperceptibly, and I could see the conflict tightening her shoulders, creeping up her neck, settling into the corners of her eyes. She looked at the carved rose on the lid, and I recognized the way her thumb traced it. Slow, careful, the way she used to trace the edge of her father's workbench when she was small. She knew on some level what this gift meant, even without knowing the full story. But knowing and speaking were two separate things. Across the room, Aaron watched her closely. Not with anger, not with support, but with expectation, silent, heavy expectation. As though he were waiting to see which side she would lean toward. His family or her mother. His world or her history. For a moment, Lila opened her mouth. I saw her gather air as if she were about to say something. Anything. Defense. Correction. A request for respect. But then Vivian let out a little laugh, soft but pointed, and her daughters echoed it like a choir trained to harmonize in mockery. That tiny sound snapped Lila's confidence in two. She exhaled quietly, shoulders sinking, and whatever words she had died before they even took shape. She closed the jewelry box gently and placed it on her lap, her eyes dropping to the floor. I saw it happen in real time. The moment my daughter chose silence. A silence built from fear of conflict, fear of embarrassment, fear of being the outsider in a world she had tried so desperately to fit into. She had molded herself around their expectations since the day she married Aaron. Toned down her laugh, changed her hairstyle, traded her colorful clothes for muted ones, stopped talking about her childhood because it felt too casual for the Harper family's dinner table. And now, when it mattered most, she swallowed her voice again. I kept my face composed, even as something small and sharp twisted inside my chest. Pain pushed against my ribs in a slow, steady bloom. But outwardly, I gave the room one of those practiced smiles, the kind mothers are forced to learn, the kind that hides bruises of the heart. It's just a little keepsake, I said softly, letting my voice smooth out all the edges I couldn't fix. Nothing special. I shouldn't have said that. It wasn't true. But in that moment, it felt like the only shield I had left. A way to make the room breathe again. A way to protect my daughter from the humiliation she clearly feared. Vivian nodded, pleased, as though she had successfully corrected a misstep. Oh, of course, she replied lightly. Sentimental things always matter, to some people. Alyssa took a sip of her wine and whispered too loudly. I guess everyone gives within their means. Grace snorted into her napkin, poorly concealing a grin. Lila flinched at that. It wasn't big, not enough for the others to see, but I saw it. The tiny recoil in her shoulders. The tightening of her jaw. Her grip on the jewelry box shifting just a bit, as though she wanted to pull it closer to her chest but didn't dare. I reached over and touched her hand gently. It's all right, I whispered, so quietly that only she could hear it. Really? She nodded, but her eyes remained fixed on her lap. Glossy with unshed tears, she refused to blink away. I could see her fighting to hold herself together, fighting to navigate a room that demanded she forget where she came from. She wasn't ashamed of me, she never had been. She was afraid. Afraid of disappointing a family that measured worth by bank accounts and brands. A family that treated sentiment like clutter and kindness like weakness. And as I sat there watching her fold herself into quiet obedience, something inside me cracked. Not loudly, not suddenly, but with the slow, aching inevitability of ice breaking beneath steady weight. It was the realization that I had lost my daughter long before this moment. Not fully. Not forever. But piece by piece, year by year, as she tried to belong to people who valued nothing I ever taught her. Still, I didn't cry. I didn't tremble. I simply sat there, smiling faintly while the Harpers resumed their laughter, as if they hadn't just trampled over the last tangible piece of my husband's love. I held my posture, my breath, my dignity. But as I watched Lila shrink in her chair, silenced by the people she married into, I understood something with terrible clarity. Some wounds don't bleed on the outside. Some wounds grow quietly. And this one had just begun to deepen. The moment the gifts were opened, the room changed. It wasn't sudden. It was quieter than that, more insidious. The shift settled into the walls, into the corners of the table, into the glances shared between members of the Harper family as we returned to our seats for dinner. Everything looked the same on the surface. Candles flickering, wine being poured, silverware arranged so neatly you'd think no one had ever touched it. But underneath, something unpleasant began to thrum, like a low hum only I could hear. Vivian took her place at the head of the table, smiling as if nothing had happened. But I caught the way her lips twitched whenever she glanced at the gift table behind us. A small private amusement. The kind that stuck under the skin. Soon the conversation started up again, but they were different now. There was a sharpness to them. A tone threaded with superiority, like a strand of wire running through silk. Alyssa leaned toward her sister, whispering just loud enough for others to hear. I guess some people just don't understand what's appropriate. Grace giggled, covering her mouth in a mock show of modesty. It's not her fault. She probably did the best she could. Their voices floated across the table like smoke, thin, curling, hard to grab but impossible to ignore. Aaron cleared his throat, shifting in his seat. He wasn't laughing, but he wasn't stepping in either. His eyes met mine briefly, and he offered an awkward half-smile, the kind someone gives when they want to distance themselves from embarrassment. My embarrassment. Lila sat frozen beside him, the jewelry box still tucked on her lap beneath the table. Her fingers rested on the lid, stiff and protective, as though she could shield it from their ridicule. But she didn't speak. Not once. Vivian took a sip of wine and said, "Gift-giving is an art, truly. It shows a certain awareness of the occasion. And of standards." I felt the sting of her words, even though she was pretending to speak in general. She set her glass down with a soft clink, the crystal catching light like it wanted attention. Some people, she continued with an airy laugh, just don't have the experience to know what's expected in families like ours. Families like ours. The words slid across the table like a blade. I kept my gaze on my plate, cutting a piece of roasted chicken even though my appetite had vanished. The humiliation didn't arrive in a single blow. It seeped in slowly, settling into my ribs, my spine, the hollow beneath my sternum. I told myself I'd survived worse moments in life. Loss, grief, heartbreak. A few whispered insults shouldn't matter. But something about the casual cruelty, the way they treated me like a curiosity, a misstep in their perfect evening, made the air feel heavy. At one point, Vivian reached for the bread basket and said to no one in particular, "I always tell my children that thoughtful gifts are lovely, but refined gifts, well, they speak to character." Her eyes flicked to me briefly. I swallowed the bitterness rising in my throat. I wanted to stand up, leave, tell them they could drown in their own judgment for all I cared. But this dinner wasn't about me. It was about Lila, about the life she was trying so desperately to build, about the fragile peace she hoped to keep between two halves of her world. So I smiled when appropriate. I nodded when expected. I kept my posture straight, my voice soft, my presence small. Every once in a while, Lila looked at me with worry in her eyes. A silent apology. Plea. A quiet, "I'm sorry, Mom." She didn't speak it aloud. Not here, not tonight. But I saw the guilt tightening her face. I wanted to reach out, tell her it was all right, tell her the insults meant nothing to me. But I couldn't lie to her like that. Not when she knew me too well. The meal stretched on endlessly. Every fork scrape felt louder. Every laugh sharper. Every comment about upbringing, manners, and people who try their best dug deeper, wrapped in velvet but sharpened at the edges. By the time dessert was served, I felt worn thin. As though the weight of their judgment had settled into my bones, making each breath feel slightly heavier than the one before. No one shouted at me. No one insulted me directly. That was what made it worse. They didn't need to raise their voices. Their disdain was woven into the fabric of the evening, subtle and elegant and poisonous. And beneath the polished plates, the sparkling glasses, and the false laughter, a simple truth began to take shape inside me. This wasn't just a family dinner. It was a warning. A quiet reminder of the line they believed separated people like them from people like me. I didn't know it yet, not fully, but that night was only the beginning. Something had shifted. And the tension that settled into the room would follow me long after I left it. The evening had stretched far longer than I expected. By the time dessert plates were cleared and coffee was brought out, the conversations had softened into smaller clusters. The air still held that faint tension, thin, stretched, ready to hum again if anyone so much as brushed against it, but the harshest remarks had faded into the background. I sat near the corner of the living room, sipping slowly from a delicate porcelain cup, waiting for a moment when it would no longer seem rude to excuse myself. Lila stood across the room with Aaron, listening numbly as his family dissected the latest society wedding they'd all attended. I could tell by the way her eyes flickered toward me that she wanted the evening over just as much as I did. She kept her smile fragile, carefully placed, like a glass ornament she was terrified of dropping. That was when I heard the voice of the youngest daughter, Harper's golden child, Emma, who was 20, spoiled and absolutely oblivious. She was standing near the gift table. Her friends gathered around her like petals around a thorny rose. They weren't supposed to be there. Guests didn't roam through the gift table, but Emma liked breaking rules if she could wrap it in laughter. "Oh my God, look at this thing," she said, holding up something small. "It's totally vintage, like thrift store vintage." Her fingers brushed the brown paper that had once wrapped my gift. Her friends tittered around her. "I told Mom I could repurpose it," she continued proudly. "It'll be cute once clean it up." One of her friends blinked. "Repurpose what?" "That cheap little box from earlier," Emma said, shrugging. "I took it to my room. I'm going to sand it, maybe paint it white. Make it look like it was meant to be something." Another friend wrinkled her nose. "Wait, wasn't that a gift?" Emma snorted. "Barely. It looked like someone's school project. Honestly, I'm doing them a favor." I stopped breathing for a moment. "Repurpose. Then, paint it white." She said it with the same casual tone someone might use to describe recycling a cardboard box. I stood slowly, setting my cup down on the small table beside me. My heart tapped against my sternum in a slow, steady beat as I watched her hands gesture wildly, full of pride. She didn't just take the box. She stole it. And she had absolutely no idea what she had touched. I moved toward the gift table, pretending to look for my purse. My eyes scanned automatically, searching for the familiar shape, the soft sheen of the carved rose. It wasn't there. The gift bags towered over empty space where my small package once sat. Brown paper scraps lay scattered on the edge, carelessly torn, abandoned. Cold pulse spread through my body. I forced myself to breathe. Slowly, quietly. I walked toward the hallway, pretending to admire the photographs lining the walls, everything framed in glossy gold, everything curated to suggest perfection. But I wasn't looking at the pictures. I was looking for Emma. Her laughter echoed faintly from upstairs. I paused at the bottom of the staircase, hand resting lightly on the railing, and for a moment I considered calling out to her, asking for the box, asking if she had looked inside, asking if she had any idea what she had taken. But I stayed still. She wouldn't understand. And even if she did, she wouldn't care. Instead, I went back to the living room. I sat down. I smoothed my dress over my knees. I folded my hands. Anyone looking at me would have thought I was simply resting. But inside something was unraveling. They mocked the gift. They belittled the effort. They dismissed the sentiment. But now they had taken something far more important. Inside that jewelry box, nestled carefully beneath the pendant, had been a document. Small, folded, precious. Something from my husband's safe. Something we had kept locked away for years. A piece of paper that held more weight than anyone in the Harper family could possibly imagine. A paper that could not be replaced. A paper that did not legally belong to them. A paper that now sat in the hands of a girl who thought she was simply repurposing trash. I felt the crack form inside me, not sharp like before, but deep, running through everything I had worked so hard to hold together. My breath came slow and tight as realization settled like a stone in my stomach. It wasn't just a sentimental gift anymore. It was a problem. Dangerous one. And as Emma's laughter floated down the stairs, light and unthinking, I sat perfectly still, fighting the rising certainty that this night was about to spiral into something none of them were prepared for. Least of all me. By the time I finally stepped out of the Harper house, the night air felt cold in a way that didn't belong to the weather. It clung to my skin, sharp and heavy, as if the house had pushed its cruelty outward and sent it home with me. I walked to my car slowly, feeling every breath like a small weight pressing against my ribs. The porch light behind me cast long shadows across the driveway, stretching thin and brittle, just like the silence that had grown between Lila and me during dinner. She had hugged me before I left. Softly, quickly, almost guiltily. "Text me when you're home," she whispered. But she didn't mention the box. Neither of us did. When I reached my house, my hands shook as I unlocked the door. Not from fear, at least not in the usual sense, but from the terrible rising knowledge of what might have gone wrong. The hallway was dim, quiet, untouched. I breathed in the familiarity of my home, its softness, its lack of judgment. Everything here held memories, even the silence. Especially the silence. I walked to my bedroom, turned on the small lamp on my nightstand, and opened the top drawer of the dresser. My pulse ticked faster than the lamp's flickering bulb. Inside my drawer, wrapped carefully in an old handkerchief, was the envelope that once held the document I had placed inside the jewelry box. The envelope was still there. The document was not. A hollow feeling opened in my chest. I sat on the edge of the bed and unfolded the empty handkerchief, as if the paper might appear out of thin air. But all I found was fabric and the faint smell of cedar oil. His scent, the one that lingered all these years later, the one that had clung to the jewelry box until Emma carried it away like a toy she had won at a fair. My husband's handwriting flashed in my memory. The day he told me what the document meant, how rare it was, how carefully it had to be stored. It wasn't just sentimental. It wasn't just precious because of memory. It was protected. It belonged to our family. It belonged to our daughter. Belonged to us. And now it was gone. I pressed my fingers to my forehead, trying to steady the tremor forming behind my eyes. I had planned to explain it to Lila later, to give it to her privately, with the story of why her father kept it so close. It was supposed to be a quiet moment between a mother and daughter. A legacy passed on. Chapter closed gently. But now it was sitting in some stranger's drawer in a house full of people who didn't understand the meaning of anything that didn't glitter. I stood and walked into the kitchen, the floorboards cool beneath my feet. The house felt too quiet, too still, like it was holding its breath along with me. I paced once, then twice, trying to calm my thoughts. I told myself to wait until morning, to breathe, to think. But I couldn't. This wasn't something that could wait. My hands moved on their own as I reached for the phone. I didn't want to make the call. I didn't want to drag my daughter into a storm she never asked for, never planned for. But the law didn't care about feelings. And the document didn't belong to the girl who'd taken it. It was theft. Plain and simple. I dialed the number with fingers that had steadied despite the ache in my chest. The phone rang twice before someone answered. 911, what's your emergency? My throat tightened. For a moment I almost hung up. Almost convinced myself that I could fix it quietly, that I could retrieve the box without involving authorities, without shaming Lila's in-laws, without turning a humiliating evening into something far bigger. But then I imagined Emma sanding the box, painting it, peeling away the rose my husband carved by hand, damaging the document inside, losing it, destroying it, tossing it out because she believed she could repurpose something she did not understand. I need to report a theft, I said quietly. The dispatcher asked my name, my address, the details. I answered each one, steadying myself with every word. My voice remained calm, but I felt each sentence scraping against something tender inside me. What was taken? The dispatcher asked. I hesitated, not because I didn't know but because saying it aloud made it real. A wooden jewelry box, I said finally. And something valuable inside it. Something that legally belongs to me. Do you know who took it? Yes, I whispered. I do. There was no turning back now. As I hung up the phone, I pressed my palms flat against the counter, grounding myself. The night outside my window was still, but the storm had already been set into motion. Not by anger, not by revenge, but by necessity. A call I never wanted to make. A call that would change everything. The officers arrived sooner than I expected. I had barely finished making a pot of tea when headlights washed across my front window, followed by the crunch of tires settling against the curb. 2 officers stepped out, a man and a woman, both wearing the kind of neutral expressions that said they hadn't yet decided what the night would require of them. I opened the door before they could knock. "Ma'am," the woman officer asked gently, "you reported a theft." I nodded and stepped aside to let them in. Their presence filled the quiet of my house in a way that felt unnervingly official. They stood in my living room, hovering near the couch while I explained everything slowly. What the gift was, where I had brought it, who had handled it, who had laughed, who had touched it last. I told them about the jewelry box, the carving, and finally, the document. That was when their demeanor shifted. The male officer straightened slightly. "Just to be clear, ma'am," he said, "you're saying the missing item is part of a documented registry?" I nodded, feeling that familiar tightness rise in my throat. "Yes. And this registry?" The woman officer pulled a small notepad from her pocket. "It's connected to your late husband's estate." I hesitated. For a moment, memories tangled with fear. My husband had been meticulous, almost obsessive, about keeping certain documents safe. Some were sentimental, some were financial. But this one, that paper tucked inside the jewelry box, was different. It was rare, legally significant, and absolutely irreplaceable. "Yes," I said quietly. "It's part of an inheritance file. Also tied to a case he was involved in years ago." They both looked up at that. "A legal case?" the man asked. "A registry that was part of it," I clarified. "He kept the document locked away until he died. I meant to give it to our daughter tonight." The officers exchanged a look, subtle but unmistakable. This wasn't just a missing trinket anymore. Their pens moved faster. "Do you know who took it?" the woman asked again, her tone firmer this time, more official. My heartbeat thudded in my ears. I clasped my hands together to keep them steady, but even that small gesture exposed the tremor running beneath my skin. I knew the truth. I had known the moment Emma bragged about repurposing the box like it was some yard sale scrap. But saying her name felt like betraying my daughter by extension, dragging her into something messy and public. "Ma'am," the male officer said gently, "if the item is part of a legal registry, it's considered protected property. If it was removed without your consent, we have to treat it seriously." I breathed slowly through my nose. They weren't being dramatic. They were being factual. It wasn't just a sentimental gift. It wasn't simply a wooden box. It was evidence. It was inheritance. It was part of a sealed archive of my husband's affairs. If that document ended up damaged, lost, or disposed of, the consequences would ripple far beyond a single family dinner. The woman officer waited, pen poised. "Do you know where the item is now?" My voice felt caught between two loyalties, one to my husband's memory, one to my daughter's fragile peace. I pressed my fingers lightly against the seam of my coat, grounding myself. "I know who took it," I said finally. "Name and address." The officers weren't impatient, but the air felt heavier now, as if the entire room held its breath. I swallowed. "It was taken by my daughter's sister-in-law," I whispered. "Her name is Emma Harper." The male officer jotted the name down. "And the address?" I looked toward the small photo of Lila on my bookshelf. Her smile bright, her eyes soft, her world still simple then. I wasn't just giving them an address. I was handing them the path straight into the home where she now lived her life, the family she had married into, the people she was trying desperately to please. But the truth was simple. They had taken something that didn't belong to them, something they had no right to handle, something they mocked because they didn't understand what it held. I took a deep breath, exhaled. Then I gave them the address. The woman officer nodded, her expression shifting into determination. "We'll go tonight," she said. "Given the nature of the missing item, earlier is better." They thanked me for my cooperation and walked toward the door. I followed them, the weight of my decision pressing against my ribs. Before stepping out, the male officer paused. "We'll do our best to handle this professionally," he said. "But be prepared. People don't react well when they realize they've taken something significant." After they left, I stood at the doorway long after the patrol car disappeared down the street. The house grew quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet now. Tight, anticipatory, almost electric. I had made the call. I had spoken the names. The investigation had begun. And there was no undoing what would come next. The Harper house always looked expensive, but the next afternoon it looked theatrical. Cars lined along the curb, music floating through the open windows, guests spilling out onto the perfectly trimmed lawn in clothes chosen for the sake of being seen. It was one of their weekend socials, the kind they held often, where people wandered in and out carrying glasses of sparkling wine and exchanging compliments laced with competition. I wasn't there, but I didn't need to be to imagine the scene. I had been inside that world the night before. I knew how they curated themselves. The officers told me they would handle it quickly, discreetly, professionally. Still, I couldn't silence the anxious beat in my chest as I imagined their patrol car turning onto the Harpers' pristine street. I pictured the neighbors glancing up from their gardens, whispering behind hedges. The house, so proud with its tall windows and perfectly symmetrical landscaping, wasn't the type of place where police visits happened quietly. And I was right. Later I would hear from Lila exactly how it unfolded, how the music cut off mid-song, how the atmosphere shattered with the first glimpse of flashing lights. When the first cruiser pulled into the driveway, guests began drifting toward the entrance, forming a half-circle of confusion and curiosity. People stepped aside as the second car rolled up behind the first. Conversations stopped. Wine glasses lowered. The Harper family was nothing if not image-conscious, and this was an image they had never prepared for. Vivian was standing near the doorway, dressed in a crisp cream blouse and pearls, her social smile already in place when the officers approached. That smile dimmed instantly when she saw the badges pinned to their uniforms. "Good afternoon," the lead officer said with polite firmness. "We received a report regarding a stolen item registered under a protected estate. We're here to retrieve it." Vivian blinked, confused at first, then offended. "Stolen," she repeated, laughing lightly as though they had made a mistake. "From our home. That's impossible." Another officer stepped forward, glancing at a small notepad. "We were told the item is a carved wooden jewelry box, taken yesterday. It belongs to Mrs. Alvarez." At the sound of my name, Vivian's face tightened. Her eyes darted toward the guests, who were now leaning in subtly, pretending not to eavesdrop. "I think there must be some misunderstanding," she said, her voice cooling by several degrees. "We don't have anything like that here." But before she could usher the officers away, a voice broke through the crowd. Bright, careless, familiar. "Oh, Ma." She emerged from the staircase, her phone in one hand. Her expression shining with a kind of oblivious confidence only the sheltered possessed. "Are you here about the box? The vintage one?" she asked, strolling forward as if she were greeting delivery workers. Vivian spun toward her, eyes wide, lips tightening. But it was too late. The lead officer nodded. "Yes. We'll need to see it." Emma shrugged. "Sure. It's in my room. I told Mom I was fixing it up." "Emma," Vivian hissed, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. But the officers were already stepping inside. Guests moved aside like parting waves, murmuring to one another in astonished whispers. A few lifted their phones, some subtly, others not at all. The Harper family was well known in their circles. And nothing attracted attention faster than a scandal dressed in police uniforms. The officers followed Emma upstairs, past the framed family portraits and spotless hallways. When they reached her room, she pushed the door open casually. "There," she said, pointing toward her desk. "I was going to repaint it. It looked kind of." But she didn't finish. Because the officers weren't looking at the box the way she expected. They didn't see a craft project. They didn't see a rustic trinket. They saw evidence. One officer slipped on gloves before picking it up. The lid was scratched, fresh marks. The carved rose had a faint sanded patch, as if Emma had already begun repurposing it. "My husband's work, scraped carelessly by a girl who didn't even know the story behind it." Inside, the velvet lining had been disturbed, the imprint of the missing document still visible like a ghost. "Where is the paper that was inside?" the officer asked. Emma blinked. "Paper. I didn't see any paper." The second officer's face darkened. It was part of an estate registry. Legally protected. Vivian, now pale and trembling with embarrassment, tried to regain control. "Surely this doesn't require such dramatics. It was just a little wooden box." "It's theft," the officer replied calmly. "And the missing document must be recovered." Guests hovered at the top of the stairs now, each pretending to adjust their position just enough to see more clearly. A soft gasp rippled through the hall. Aaron appeared, equally stunned. He looked at the box, then at Emma, then at his mother. His silence said everything. Lila stood behind him, her face drained of color. Her eyes locked on the box, and something inside her seemed to collapse inward. The officers carried the box downstairs as though they were carrying evidence from a crime scene. 'Cause they were. And as they exited the Harper home, past the shocked guests, past the frozen family, past the carefully constructed image, everyone knew. This would not disappear quietly. The Harpers' laughter from the night before had finally been answered. And the consequences had only just arrived. The officers had already made their way downstairs, but the Harper family followed closely behind, their once proud posture fractured by tension. Vivian's heels clicked sharply against the polished floors, each step betraying more panic than poise. Her guests hovered like startled birds, whispering into their glasses or into each other's ears as though the whole spectacle had been arranged for their entertainment. The Harper home, usually so tightly controlled and perfectly maintained, now vibrated with an energy none of them knew how to hide. "Officer, I assure you," Vivian began, adjusting her blouse as though straightening fabric could straighten the situation, "we don't have anything belonging to Mrs. Alvarez. You must be mistaken." Her voice carried the brittle confidence of someone used to being believed simply because she said something. But the officers weren't here to please her. They scanned the room with steady eyes, their professionalism a stark contrast to the rising fluster around them. "We have reason to believe the missing item is still in this residence," the lead officer replied. Aaron stepped forward, trying to reassert calm. "If there's been some misunderstanding, I'm sure we can talk through it." The officer held up a hand, stopping him gently but firmly. "We're not here for discussion. We're here for the item." Grace crossed her arms, her earlier bravado crumbling. "This is ridiculous. Why would we steal some wooden box?" Alyssa chimed in, voice sharp. "What would we even do with something like that? It looked like it came from a flea market." Emma, standing at the bottom of the stairs, shifted nervously, her bravado nowhere to be found. She wasn't saying anything now. She was too busy trying not to meet anyone's eyes. The officers exchanged a glance. "Miss," the female officer said to Emma, "you stated you had taken the item upstairs to repurpose it." Emma swallowed. I didn't take anything important. I just thought it was unused. It looked like trash. I wasn't stealing." Vivian gasped softly, spinning toward her daughter. "Emma, why would you touch something that didn't belong to you? You didn't say anything." Emma shot back, her voice rising. "You were all laughing about it. I thought it was okay." "We were not laughing," Alyssa snapped, though her tone made it clear that they absolutely had been. "We were laughing at how unusual it was," Grace corrected weakly, face flushing. "Not giving permission to steal it." The officers let them bicker for a moment. Then the male officer stepped toward the living room cabinet, a large piece of furniture with gold-trimmed edges and decorative handles. It was meant to be admired, not touched. But he opened it anyway. Inside the top drawer, beneath a pile of coasters and unused monogrammed napkins, lay the jewelry box. The room froze. The carved rose on top had a faint scratch across one petal, as if Emma's sandpaper had already begun its damage. The sight alone made something inside the house's carefully curated facade crack. "There it is," the officer said quietly. Vivian's face went pale. I don't understand how that got there." Alyssa pointed at Emma immediately. "She must have put it there. She hides things all the time." "I do not." Emma shot back, tears starting to form. "I put it on my desk. Mom probably moved it because she didn't want guests seeing it." "How dare you suggest that?" Vivian gasped, her voice climbing. "Why would I hide something that didn't belong to us?" Grace scoffed. "You hide plenty of things, Mother." "Enough," Aaron muttered, pinching the bridge of his nose. The confident eldest son, the pride of the Harper line, now looked like a man watching his family unravel thread by thread. The female officer lifted the jewelry box with gloved hands. "This is the stolen item." Both officers waited. The entire family stared at the box like it might burst into flames. Vivian finally exhaled shakily. "We didn't know it was valuable. We didn't know it was stolen." Alyssa added. "We didn't know there was anything inside it." Grace insisted. "I didn't take anything from inside." Emma whimpered. Their excuses tripped over each other, voices overlapping, rising higher with every second. The Harper family, who last night sat in polished elegance, smirking at my humble gift, now looked like a cluster of children caught red-handed. Their smirks were gone. Their laughter was gone. Their judgment dissolved into frantic explanations and trembling voices. The officers didn't raise their tones. They didn't threaten. They didn't need to. Because the Harper family had already exposed themselves. As the lead officer closed the jewelry box and tucked it into an evidence bag, he spoke in a calm, unwavering voice. "We'll be filing a report. You'll be contacted regarding next steps." Vivian tried to speak, but the words caught in her throat. Her perfect image, her perfected control had shattered. And for the first time since I had known them, the Harper family didn't look powerful. They looked afraid. And with good reason. The moment the jewelry box slid into the evidence bag, the atmosphere in the Harper home changed into something dense, almost unbreathable. The officers didn't leave immediately. They stood their ground, as though the walls themselves were listening. Vivian clutched the back of a dining chair like she needed it to steady her. Alyssa and Grace hovered near the staircase, faces pale, eyes darting nervously between the officers and the crowd building on the porch. Emma stood frozen, her arms wrapped around herself, no longer the girl who had bragged about repurposing, a gift she didn't understand. The male officer cleared his throat and addressed the family in a voice that carried the authority of fact. "The reason we're here is not simply because a wooden jewelry box was taken. The significance lies in what was inside." He withdrew a folded sheet from his pocket. "My statement from the night before. The missing document tied to this item is registered under a federal inheritance file. It is a legally protected document linked to the estate of Mr. Alvarez. The name hit the room like a dropped vase. Shattered silence followed. This isn't just sentimental property, the officer continued. This type of document is logged, catalogued, and traceable. Removing it without permission is considered unlawful possession of protected material. Vivian's lips parted, but no sound came out at first. When she finally spoke, her voice trembled with disbelief. Protected. But it was just an old paper. What could possibly be so important about it? The officer exchanged a glance with his partner, then explained, patient yet firm. This specific document, though we cannot disclose all details at this time, is tied to a registry that required legal clearance when it was created. It contains identifying information, notarized records, and evidence related to a case Mr. Alvarez worked on. In short, it's not the kind of item one can simply misplace or repurpose. He emphasized the word repurpose, and Emma flinched visibly. Because it is part of an estate claim, he added, its removal constitutes a potential felony depending on the condition in which it is recovered. A harsh gasp escaped someone at the doorway. It wasn't a member of the family. It was a neighbor. A woman in a navy dress with a sparkling necklace. Someone who frequently attended the Harpers' gatherings. She must have been one of the guests who drifted closer when the officers arrived. And she wasn't alone. Behind her, more faces appeared. Curious, wide-eyed whispering. The perfect Harper facade had cracked, and everyone within a two-house radius seemed eager to peek into the opening. "My goodness," someone murmured. "Is this serious?" Another whispered. "They hid something. The Harpers." Word was spreading like a spilled drink across polished marble. Fast, impossible to absorb, staining everything in its path. Vivian seemed to notice the movement at the doorway for the first time. Her spine straightened, and her voice sharpened with panic. "Officers, can we please discuss this privately? There's no need to make a scene." "We're not making a scene, ma'am," the female officer replied calmly. "We are informing you of the legal implications." Grace stepped forward, her voice cracking. "Are you saying we could actually be charged for this? For a box? For a protected item taken without consent?" the officer corrected. "Yes, absolutely." Emma burst into tears. I didn't know it was important. I thought it was just some cheap thing." Vivian's face collapsed into a mixture of horror and fury. She grabbed Emma's arm, pulling her closer. "Why would you take something from our guest? Why?" Emma cried harder. "You were laughing at it. Everyone was. I thought no one cared." Her words hung in the air like smoke. The truth, spoken aloud, stung sharper than any accusation the officers could have made. Alyssa looked away. Grace covered her mouth. Aaron closed his eyes as though trying to erase the entire afternoon. Even the neighbors, still watching, sensed the shift. The raw, embarrassing reveal of who the Harpers really were behind their expensive walls and curated smiles. The officer continued, but the family barely heard him. His words fell into the room like steady stones. "Until the missing document is recovered, you remain under investigation. You will be contacted again within 48 hours. Do not tamper with the box any further. Do not attempt to destroy or conceal anything else connected to it." The Harpers nodded mechanically, too stunned to interrupt. And outside, the whispers grew louder. "It was them. They stole something. I can't believe it. All that money, and they're taking things from guests. Imagine the embarrassment. The family who mocked me, who smirked at my gift, who dismissed it as worthless, now stood exposed, stripped bare under the eyes of everyone they had ever tried to impress. Their faces, once so confident, now held the unmistakable glaze of people who realized too late that some lines should never be crossed. And the worst part for them. This was only the beginning. Lila had been standing near the staircase, quiet, pale, gripping the railing as if it were the only solid thing in the room. Everything around her had unraveled so quickly. The police, the accusations, the whispers trailing through the doorway like a breeze carrying humiliation. She watched her in-laws flounder and blame one another, watched her mother's name tossed around like an inconvenience, watched a document tied to her late father treated as disposable. I could see the storm brewing behind her eyes long before she opened her mouth. But when it happened, it wasn't loud at first. It was quiet, too quiet. Enough. One word. Dark. Flat. Final. The room froze. Even the guests at the doorway fell silent. Vivian turned, startled. Aaron blinked as if he had misheard. Emma stopped crying long enough to stare. "Lila," Aaron whispered. She stepped forward slowly, releasing her grip on the railing. Her hands trembled, but her voice didn't. Her voice was steel, polished, deliberate, the kind she had learned to craft after years of swallowing her truth. "No more excuses," she said. "No more pretending this is a misunderstanding. You took my mother's gift. You laughed at her. You humiliated her in your own home. And now you're trying to pretend none of you had anything to do with it." Vivian opened her mouth, but Lila cut her off with a look so sharp it could have sliced marble. "Don't," she warned. "Just don't." The officer stepped back slightly, giving her space. Not physically but morally, because the authority in her voice was enough to claim the room. For years, Lila had kept her tone soft around the Harpers. Careful. Agreeable. She trimmed her words to fit the length of their expectations, never daring to raise her voice, never daring to disrupt the pristine illusion of their family. But she wasn't doing that now. She turned to Emma. "You took something that didn't belong to you. You bragged about it. You scraped it. You opened it. And you threw away the paper that was inside without even looking at it, didn't you?" Emma froze. Her lips parted. No protest came. "That document was meant for me," Lila continued, voice cracking just slightly at the edges. "It was from my father. You didn't just steal from my mother. You stole from me." Emma's face crumpled. Alyssa stepped in weakly. "Lila," she didn't mean. "Stop." Lila's voice rose. "You always do this. All of you. You pretend your intentions erase your actions. You pretend if you laugh while doing something cruel, it makes it harmless." Vivian gasped, as though personally wounded. "Lila, that's unfair." "No, what's unfair," Lila snapped, "is that my mother has spent every visit trying to earn a basic level of respect that you refuse to give her. She's polite. She's kind. She has never once made you feel beneath her. But you," her voice trembled with fury, "you treat her like she's worth less because she doesn't live the way you do. Because she doesn't spend money the way you do. Because she doesn't hide her life behind shiny surfaces and expensive decorations." The neighbors at the doorway exchanged glances. Others moved closer, pretending to be tying shoes or adjusting coats, anything to justify witnessing what had clearly been a long time coming. Aaron finally found his voice. "Lila, we can talk about this later." "No," she said, turning to him. "We talk about it now. Because you watched them mock her. You watched them treat her like she was embarrassing. And you did nothing." He blinked, stunned. "I didn't want to escalate things." "You didn't want them to think less of you," she corrected. "You didn't want to disrupt the fantasy that your family is perfect." His face reddened. Something defensive rose in his eyes, and then fell because he couldn't deny it. "My mother has never given you less than respect," Lila said, her voice softening only in sadness. "And yet you let your family tear her apart over a gift she poured her heart into." Vivian stepped forward, trying to salvage the situation with her familiar icy calm. "Lila, darling, you are overreacting." Lila laughed. A brittle, heartbroken sound. "Overreacting. Do you know what was inside that box? Do you know what that document meant? You didn't even give her a chance to explain before tearing it apart with your jokes." She looked at her mother then, finally, and the guilt in her eyes was so raw it almost buckled her knees. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry, Mom. I should have defended you. I should have done it years ago." I felt the room tilt, as though time itself paused around that moment. Her voice grew steadier again as she turned to the officers. My mother told the truth. I'll cooperate fully. Whatever she needs. Then, one by one, the members of the Harper family lowered their eyes. Not out of shame, but because they had finally been seen for who they were. And Lila, for the first time in years, stood not with them, but apart from them. With me. The house felt different after Lila's voice cut through it. Different in a way that made even the walls seem to exhale. The tension was still thick, still pulsing in the air, but it had shifted directions. No longer crushing me. No longer pressing down on Lila. It was turned squarely toward the Harpers, and for the first time all evening, they didn't know where to look or what to say. The officers waited patiently as the room settled into a trembling silence. They weren't rushed. They weren't bending to anyone's panic. They simply watched, their presence a reminder that this was no longer a matter of family dynamics or bruised pride. It was law, evidence, responsibility. And it was my turn to speak. The female officer stepped forward. Mrs. Alvarez, she said calmly, we need to ask what outcome you're seeking here. Do you want to pursue charges? Do you want us to move forward with a report? This is your call. All eyes turned to me. Vivian, pale and rattled, clutched her necklace as though she feared it might be the next thing ripped from her possession. Alyssa and Grace hovered like shadows behind her. Emma's face was blotchy from crying, mascara streaking beneath her eyes. Erin stood stiffly beside Lila, torn between guilt and fear, still unsure which side to lean toward. And Lila, my daughter, looked at me with a mixture of hope and dread. She wasn't asking me to protect her husband's family. She wasn't even asking me to protect her. She simply looked afraid of what this decision might cost us. I felt the weight of that look settle in my chest. I had come here to face the truth of what was taken. Not just a wooden box, not just a carved rose, not just a document, but a piece of my husband's legacy. Something he had trusted me to safeguard. Something meant for our daughter. Something tied to a long-closed chapter of his life that the Harpers had treated like garbage. But Lila had found her voice today. She had stood up for me in a way she never had before. She had chosen truth over comfort, love over appearance. And now it was my turn to choose my daughter. I stepped forward slowly, letting the room's silence settle around me. I want justice, I said. My voice didn't shake. But not vengeance. The officers nodded, listening carefully. I continued. I want the item documented. I want the box returned. I want the missing paper found if possible. And I want a record showing that what happened here wasn't harmless or accidental. I let my eyes drift to Emma, who flinched. But I don't want to press felony charges, I added quietly. Not if the box is returned intact and the paper is found. A ripple went through the room. Not relief exactly, something closer to shock. Vivian blinked rapidly, as though struggling to process mercy from someone she had spent all evening belittling. Alyssa and Grace looked at each other, stunned. Even the neighbors outside reacted with soft murmurs, surprised, maybe even disappointed that the scandal might not escalate into handcuffs. But the only reaction that mattered was Lila's. She stared at me with parted lips, her eyes shining, not just with tears but with something deeper. Gratitude, grief, reverence, love she hadn't been able to show before. She stepped closer, her hand brushing mine in a soft, trembling gesture. Mom, she whispered. I squeezed her fingers gently. You're my daughter, I whispered back. I won't let their choices destroy your life. I didn't say that her silence had hurt me. I didn't say that watching her shrink inside that house for months had broken my heart. I didn't say that I feared losing her more than I feared losing anything else. Some things mothers bury quietly. The female officer nodded. We can proceed with a formal report without pushing for criminal charges, as long as you cooperate with recovery. That's what I want, I said. Emma sobbed again, her hands covering her face. Vivian sagged into a chair, looking suddenly older than she had minutes earlier. Alyssa muttered something under her breath. Grace stared at the wall like it held a secret escape door. The room was full of people, Yet for a moment it felt like only Lila and I were standing there, two women painfully stitched back together after years of distance. "Thank you," Lila whispered again, voice cracking. The officers gathered their notes. One placed the evidence bag carefully into a case. Another stepped outside to speak with the guests who had been crowding the doorway, dispersing them with gentle authority. And in that moment, amid the shame blanketing the Harpers and the quiet chaos outside their pristine home, I felt something steady return to my bones. Not victory, not satisfaction, just peace. The kind you earn when you choose the person you love, even when they haven't always chosen you. The fallout did not happen all at once. It came in waves, slow at first, then relentless. The Harpers had always lived in a world where problems were handled quietly, smoothed over with influence, concealed behind carefully curated appearances. But the stolen document, recorded in a protected registry and traced through legal channels, was not something that could be swept under a silk rug or hushed with donations. It moved through the system with the cold efficiency of paperwork and procedure, and for the first time the Harper name carried no weight against it. Within 48 hours, they received their first formal notice, a citation for unlawful possession of protected property. It came with fines that weren't devastating to them financially, but it was the accompanying language that struck hardest. The clear outline of their violation, the documentation of their actions, the official confirmation that they had mishandled estate property and interfered with registered materials. It was recorded, filed, permanent. Vivian tried, of course, to fix it the way she fixed everything. Phone calls, connections, favors owed from charity galas or holiday auctions. But every person she reached out to gave the same answer. There was nothing to fix. The chain of custody was logged. The evidence had been collected. The case was being handled exactly as the law required. The humiliation sank its teeth in publicly. By the end of the week, whispers spread through their social circle like seeds scattered in the wind. Neighbors who had watched the police cars arrive felt no obligation to shield the Harpers' dignity. Their world was built on immaculate lawns, spotless reputations, and carefully maintained facades, but gossip slipped through cracks faster than money could plaster them. At the grocery store, the woman who used to brag about Vivian's impeccable taste whispered to her friend near the produce aisle, "You know they stole something from a guest? Police and everything." At the country club, a pair of men lowered their voices over drinks. "Protected document." Imagine the stupidity. At the salon, someone laughed softly as she flipped through a magazine. All that wealth, and they're stealing keepsakes. The Harpers could feel it. In every glance held a fraction too long. In every smile that seemed strained. In every conversation that paused when they entered the room. This was a social class where humiliation was more painful than legal action. The fines were manageable. The embarrassment was crippling. Alyssa withdrew from her yoga group, claiming she needed time to herself, though everyone knew she couldn't stand the stairs. Grace avoided her usual brunch spots. Even Emma, who had once floated through life with a bubble of invincible privilege surrounding her, now walked with smaller steps, quieter movements. Her arrogance punctured by the memory of officers finding the box in a drawer she swore she hadn't touched. But the worst consequences fell on Vivian. She had spent decades crafting her identity like a sculpture, every social connection polished, every event planned to perfection, every detail of her life arranged to reflect status. A single ripple could ruin the image she worked so hard to protect. And this was not a ripple. It was a rupture. For the first time, people looked at her with something other than admiration. They looked with pity, with disbelief, with a thin veil of amusement. And Vivian Harper, who prided herself on being untouchable, found herself judged in the same merciless way she had judged so many others. She tried hosting again weeks later. Small gatherings at first, quiet dinners, then a brunch. But even those failed to revive her confidence. Guests attended, but they scanned the room with a faint expectation that something might explode again. Some even asked in hushed tones, "Is that the Box family?" As though identifying a type of social misbehavior. Their wealth did nothing to soften the blow. Money couldn't erase the police report. Money couldn't silence the neighbors. Money couldn't rebuild the image that shattered the moment flashing lights touched their driveway. Even Aaron felt the consequences. His colleagues joked awkwardly, then stopped when he didn't laugh. His team members began avoiding mentions of family altogether. At one meeting someone muttered, "Maybe check your pockets," half joking, but the joke hit too close to home, and his jaw tightened visibly. Lila watched all of this unfold with a complicated expression. One part sadness, one part clarity, one part a quiet recognition of the life she had been bending herself to fit into. She saw how fragile their version of perfection really was, how quickly it collapsed when pressed against truth. But for me, the consequences weren't about revenge. They weren't about satisfaction. They were simply the natural result of choices they never expected would return to them. The Harpers had treated my husband's memory like trash. They had mocked something carved from love. They had dismissed me, belittled me, and taken something they had no right to touch. And now the world they valued most, the world of opinions, whispers, and reputations, was doing what the law began, holding them accountable, not through anger, but through exposure. The house was quiet when we walked through the door, quiet in a way that felt like an exhale after holding breath for far too long. Lila stepped inside first, her shoulders slumped, her makeup smudged from tears she didn't bother to wipe. For a moment, she simply stood there, in the small entryway she used to breeze through as a teenager, touching the frame of the old family photo hanging crooked on the wall, as if grounding herself in something familiar. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. The silence between us finally felt safe. I set my purse down and hung my coat, watching her with the gentle caution of a mother trying not to crowd her child's pain. She drifted into the living room and sat on the couch like she'd been carrying a weight too heavy to balance. When she looked up at me, her eyes were glassy with regret, a kind of regret that takes years to shape. "Mom," she whispered, voice catching, "I'm so sorry." The words fell out of her as if they had been trapped behind her ribs. She covered her face with her hands and leaned forward, elbows on her knees, her body curling in like she needed to shrink away from her own guilt. I walked over and sat beside her, not touching her yet. I wanted her to speak freely, to choose her own way back to me. "I should have defended you," she continued. "All those times. Not just today. I should have said something when they made little comments about how you dressed or how you talked or the job you worked. I should have spoken up when they laughed at the things Dad made. I knew it hurt you. And I looked away." Her voice trembled. "I'm sorry I let them make me feel ashamed of where I came from." I closed my eyes for a moment, letting her words settle. She wasn't just apologizing for tonight. She was apologizing for years of trying to mold herself into someone she thought her husband's family would accept. Years of forcing herself into a shape that didn't fit. She wiped her cheeks with the back of her hand and continued. "I kept trying to prove to them that I belonged, that I could be one of them, that I wasn't lesser." Her voice cracked. "And in trying so hard, I left you standing alone. And you didn't deserve that." I reached for her hand finally, folding it into mine. Her fingers were cold. "Lila," I murmured, "you were never lesser. Not once. Not ever." She sobbed softly, her body shaking with relief and shame all tangled together. "I thought they were my family," she whispered. "But they never really let me in. Not fully. Not in a way that mattered." I brushed her hair behind her ear like I used to when she was little. "Some people mistake wealth for worth," I said. "They think having more makes them more. But it doesn't." She nodded, her breath uneven. "Real family," I continued, "is not the one that criticizes you into silence. It's not the one that asks you to hide yourself. It's not the one that uses money as a way to measure love." I squeezed her hand gently. "Real family shows up. They protect you. They speak truth even when it's uncomfortable. They love without needing to perform." She leaned her head on my shoulder then, her tears soaking through the fabric of my blouse. I wrapped an arm around her, feeling her relax into me the way she hadn't done in years. It was a small, fragile thing, this return, but it was real. After a long while, she whispered, "I forgot who I was with them. I forgot who I wanted to be. But today, when I saw how they treated you, it was like something broke open. She inhaled shakily. I don't want to be like them. I don't want to raise my future children around people who laugh at kindness and shame generosity. I stroked her back slowly. Then don't, I said softly. You choose your family. Blood gives us connection. But character gives us home. She pulled back slightly, looking at me through blurry eyes. I want home to be with you, she said. I want to stop pretending. I want to build something real. A warmth spread in my chest. Quiet, steady, healing. You already are, I told her. The room settled into a peaceful stillness. Outside, the evening darkened, but inside, something long overdue had begun to mend. She rested her head on my shoulder again, and I held her as though she were still that little girl clutching her father's handmade toys, unaware that one day the world would try to make her feel small. But she wasn't small. She was mine. And for the first time in a long time, she remembered who her real family was.